In Super Mario's first decade of existence, what I refer to as the classic era of Mario, there was already a surprising number of spin-offs featuring the eponymous Italian plumber, and not just the usual 80s and 90s fare of cheaply produced off-model typing tutors and educational games and the like. Mario's mug appeared on unique puzzle games like Dr. Mario and Picross, a racing game that smoothly incorporated classic platformer tropes into its racetracks, and a portable side series that was notably innovative and spawned a popular new hero, who would later carry on the tradition in his own offbeat way. But it was Mario's second decade, from 1996 to 2006, roughly speaking the era of the N64 and GameCube, in which Mario's spin-offs really took off, both in quality and in quantity. These were no longer wild, swing-for-the-fences experiments. They were full-fledged series that rivaled and sometimes even outdid the sales of the platformers which gave rise to them. And one of the biggest changes that accompanied this increase in status was a shifting of emphasis from Mario himself, the hero, to the motley crew of allies and enemies he'd run across in his travels. Like most video game icons, but notably unlike his rival Sonic the Hedgehog, Mario wasn't originally designed with the expectation that he would be a big shot. He's not even the title character of the game which introduced him to the world, the 1981 arcade platformer Donkey Kong. So early on, the details of his character owed far more to programming limitations and sudden, almost random bursts of inspiration than they did to deliberate, long-term character design. Mario had a hat and a mustache because these details make it possible to identify him as human, despite the tiny sprite size allowed by early arcade cabinets. He wore overalls because they're easy to draw, and it made his be-shirted arms stand out better from his torso. He's Italian because it worked with the mustache, and a plumber because that explained what he was doing in the sewers when Mario Brothers came along in 1983. These details are often considered iconic, but just like Mickey Mouse's ears appearing on one side of his head in profile, and The Simpsons only having 3 fingers and a thumb on each hand, they were shortcuts as much as they were anything else. So when Mario became an international superstar after the success of Super Mario Brothers in 1985, one of Nintendo's first impulses was to flesh out the character a little, add some facets to his personality that would make him a more interesting subject for t-shirts and lunchboxes. In less than a year, they had sponsored the production of a movie featuring all the major characters from Super Mario Bros., and there's a lot of fascinating details contained within that I don't have time to get into here. But another way for them to personalize Mario was to make spin-offs, featuring him doing something other than jumping on top of or over things. In the early days of his fame, Mario hopped between all kinds of unusual jobs, including demolitions expert, referee, professional golfer, spacefarer, physician, aviator, juggler, painter, archaeologist, knitting instructor, and assistant key grip. But what really stands out to me about these roles isn't how outlandish they are, but how solitary most of them are. Leaving aside the games where he's just putting in a cameo appearance, like Punch-Out!, Mario was a bit of a lone wolf during this era, appearing in games where he's usually the only person on screen. If these games show us new aspects of Mario as a character, it's equally true that Mario's presence on its own adds charm to what would otherwise be quite a dry and formulaic experience. But by the early 1990s, a new kind of Mario spin-off was emerging, one which would follow the pattern of The Great Mission to Rescue Princess Peach by featuring multiple Mario characters working together, or more often against each other, to get something done. Super Mario Kart was the first spin-off of this type, and I think it has to be said that Mario in this game is not a very interesting character, in part because he was chosen to be the standard option in terms of top speed and acceleration, the neutral good human fighter of racing games. If you have any kind of strategy for playing Mario Kart, Mario is probably not the racer you're going to end up with. Personally, I always played as Toad or Yoshi instead. Unfortunately, it seems that as long as there are going to be multiple Mario characters in need of development, attempts to make the secondary characters more interesting will typically have the side effect of making Mario himself seem more boring by comparison. If a Mario Kart game features racetracks that are themed after different characters, the Mario circuit is bound to be the generic one with the fewest turns. Unless it's the Luigi circuit, because Lord knows he hasn't suffered enough in this life. If he shows up in an event match in Super Smash Bros., it'll be him versus Bowser, one-on-one with 2 stocks each. Or fighting him and Luigi at the same time. Whoa, what a concept. If he gets his own Mario Party board? Okay, actually, Mario's Rainbow Castle is pretty kick-ass. So this isn't a hard and fast rule, just a general trend. Nintendo's attitude from 1996 to 2006 seems to have been somewhere between Mario has gotten as much backstory as he needs, so let's move on to other characters, and Mario is inherently a simple guy, so why should we keep working on him and possibly lose that magic? Both of which I at least partly agree with. So rather than take up a lot of time going back over the history of sub-series like Mario Party and Super Smash Bros., which have barely added anything to the main franchise anyway, I'm going to spend this intermission discussing the games that did for Peach, Luigi, Bowser, and all the rest of the merry band of misfits what the first decade of Mario spin-offs did for Mario alone. The most interesting story contribution a spin-off can make is probably a brand new character who becomes part of the main series, but Mario spin-offs don't do this too often. In the same time frame over which the main series introduced Princess Peach, Toad, Bowser, Luigi as something other than a recolored Mario, and Yoshi, the only recurring characters to emerge from spin-off titles were Princess Daisy and Wario. And as beloved as these two are, each has only appeared in a single mainline Mario game. Wario in the DS port of Super Mario 64, and Daisy in Super Mario Wonder just a few years ago. As the main series started slowing down with new characters in the post-classic era, the spin-offs did pretty much the same thing as before, with one new male character based on an existing one, and one new female character who gets kidnapped a lot. The male character was Waluigi, a purple-clad Dan Backslide lookalike who first appeared in Mario Tennis as Wario's doubles partner. Waluigi is one of the most celebrated and written about Mario characters ever, which is curious because Nintendo treats him like an absolute joke, just one in a series of Luigi things that Luigi has to have because Mario has one and it's in the contract. Love interest, medical degree, artistic pursuit, giant statue, and a villain implacably dedicated to his destruction for obscure, possibly non-existent reasons. Unlike Wario, Waluigi has no backstory or explanation for why he dislikes the Mario Brothers, not even in supplemental materials like manga or promotional blurbs. Even his status as Wario's stooge/lackey is full of ambiguity. Is he Wario's long-lost brother? An independent villain who one day chose to join forces with his similarly named competitor? A dim-witted underling who Wario found on the waterfront one day, abducted and forced to wear a similar outfit and mustache to himself, like what Tingle did to that one guy in the Wind Waker? There's no way to tell. The most informative source on Waluigi's personality is from a series of posts made on the Nintendo of Europe website in 2003, which is a highly questionable source because it's written from the perspective of Wario, a known pathological liar. And yet, despite his forgotten past and the fact that Nintendo persistently refuses to put him in Smash, Waluigi endures as a star in the Super Mario constellation. Here we also find the only major Mario character to hail from a Mario Kart game, Toadette, who acts as the Dak Ralter to Toad's Luke Skywalker in Mario Kart Double Dash. Toadette also doesn't have a backstory, nor has she been put into Smash, but at least she's been more prominent in the series and has had a lot more dialogue than Waluigi to establish her character. Someone at Nintendo must really love Toadette, because she has, at one time or another, wormed her way into both of the Mario RPG series, the intro to Super Mario Galaxy, more than a dozen sports and party titles, Peach's Castle in Odyssey, and full playability in 3 games, Super Mario Maker 2, the Switch port of New Super Mario Bros. U, and Super Mario Wonder. She's done a lot in her time, but these days she's most commonly seen as the platonic adventure pal of Captain Toad, being rescued by him from a giant bird, and then rescuing him from the same giant bird, which then, what a twist, kidnaps both of them at the same time. Really though, I kid. Captain Toad and Toadette's taste for adventure may be a tad bland and repetitious, but their relationship still seems a lot healthier than the one Mario and Peach have. Whew. Anyway, during what I've called the experimental era of Mario, both the main games and the spin-offs generally devoted themselves less to creating new things for the series, and more to fleshing out things that already existed. And the implications of this approach for Mario's main characters are most evident in the only part of the Mario franchise that focuses on storytelling, the RPGs. Nintendo itself had never made a classic turn-based Japanese RPG before the release of Super Mario RPG in 1996. In fact, if we're talking about the core Nintendo team, they still haven't made one. They played around with some elements of the genre, such as magic points and leveling up, in games like Zelda 2. But when it came to the genuine article, they relied on affiliates or even external partners to produce the actual guts of the game, collaborating only on the story and aesthetics to make them work with the brand. What this meant in practice was that Mario RPGs could be a lot weirder than any internal project was allowed to be. Nintendo always held veto power over anything that went too far. But since they weren't coming up with the ideas in the first place, the stories and characters in these games would reflect the partners' sensibilities more than Nintendo's. In much the same way that Rare owned Donkey Kong in the mid-90s, and Retro Studios owned Samus Aran in the mid-2000s, from 1996 well into the 21st century, Mario as a character, as opposed to a mascot and platforming protagonist, was owned not by Nintendo, but by Squaresoft, Intelligent Systems, and Alpha Dream, which was founded by ex-Square employees, so there's a certain continuity there. Now, to be fair, Mario actually doesn't get a lot of characterization in any of these games, because, in classic JRPG fashion, he's a silent protagonist. The most he ever does, by way of self-expression, is some Italian-sounding gibberish and hand gestures in the Mario and Luigi games, and an actually quite endearing habit of doing charades to show people what's happened throughout Super Mario RPG. While other characters' dialogue implies that he is indeed able to speak, the player never hears him speak, so we only get hints of his true personality from the way other characters describe him. But if we take a look at the other Mario characters and how they're used in the RPGs, personality abounds. In Super Mario RPG, for example, Peach and Bowser appear as playable party members, and they both show facets of their character that weren't seen before. Bowser spends most of the story on a down note, having been kicked out of his castle by the real villain, Smithy, and trying without much success to reform his Koopa Troop and get revenge. Mario isn't really a concern to him at this point. He has bigger fish to fry. But when he finds out that Peach is being held in Booster's tower, he shifts gears and mounts a rescue attempt, ultimately teaming up with Mario when he realizes he can't manage it on his own. Far from being intimidating, Bowser in Super Mario RPG is mostly played for comic relief. He's big and brawny, but his strength does him no good because he's constantly being outmaneuvered. Even the fact that he's kidnapped Peach several times doesn't seem to be something that other characters hold against him, because everybody knows that he always loses, and Peach always comes back safely anyway. In an odd kind of way, Bowser acts as Peach's protector in this game, because the thought of anyone else kidnapping her fills him with righteous indignation, a twist on his classic motivation that would be employed many times in future Mario RPGs. Peach is another good example of Super Mario RPG's style of playing tropes straight and then subverting them. When the story begins, she's been kidnapped by Bowser, who's easily trounced by Mario, but at the very moment she's set free, the Smithy gang invades the castle and sends everyone, Mario, Bowser, and Peach, flying into the distance. Peach lands on the top floor of a tower, the home of a rich weirdo named Booster, who immediately decides that this is a sign they should get married. She kicks and screams and calls for Mario to save her, but Booster is so dumb that he doesn't even realize she's unhappy. Things eventually work out, though. Mario and Bowser crash the wedding, they defeat an enormous mutant wedding cake, don't ask. Booster and Bowser end up kissing Mario by mistake, and Booster accepts his loss and goes back to playing with toy trains. Peach is then supposed to stay in the Mushroom Kingdom, where her flustered attendants can keep an eye on her, but she sneaks out of her room and joins the party, where she stays until the final confrontation with Smithy. Just as Bowser remains strong and short-tempered in Super Mario RPG, but also gets kicked around by the plot and shows some glimpses of buried heroism, Peach is still a damsel for much of the game, but she's also sassy and mischievous, a born adventurer who finds her royal position intolerably stuffy. You get the impression that she has more in common with Mario than in previous games, and she's often the sympathetic voice of reason that contrasts with Bowser's hot-headedness, Gino's detached seriousness, and Mallow's immaturity. Peach's character has had a lot of ups and downs over the course of the Paper Mario series, which followed in Super Mario RPG's footsteps, but she never completely lost that proactive spirit. In both Paper Mario and The Thousand-Year Door, Peach sees her kidnapping not as an excuse to sulk or give up, but as an opportunity to learn about the villain's evil plans, and even throw a wrench or two into the works. Then, in Super Paper Mario, she takes an active role yet again, as one of the 4 chosen heroes destined to save the world according to the prophetic Light Prognosticus, the others being Mario, Bowser, and Luigi. So yeah, speaking of, what about Luigi, you may be asking? Well, the truth is that Luigi doesn't get much time to shine in the Paper Mario series, and he's not in Super Mario RPG at all. In the original Paper Mario, he just hangs around the family homestead, picking up Mario's fan letters and writing in his rather passive-aggressive diary, and the subsequent games actually make a joke out of the fact that he misses out on everything cool that happens to Mario. You would think that Luigi would get better treatment in the other RPG series where he shares top billing with his little bro, Mario and Luigi, and in a sense that is true. He and Mario converse a lot in these games, he gets his own special tools and abilities to complement Mario's, and in Partners in Time there's even a subplot late in the game that revolves around Luigi overcoming his ingrained cowardice and self-loathing to become a true hero. It's sweet. But there's not much to it. And really, to get the most complete picture of what Luigi is like, as a character, but also as the thematic centerpiece of a whole game, you have to look at my personal favorite spin-off from this period, Luigi's Mansion. Hey, it's Halloween, right? I was bound to get around to this game eventually. Let me be brutally honest for a second. Even though I titled this series The Year of Mario, as an obvious contrast to Nintendo's Year of Luigi promotion in 2013, when it comes to the popularity contest between the two bros, I fall on the green side of that equation. Luigi is just a more nuanced character, and he has been since that movie came out back in 1986. Mario in this film is your typical small-town guy who daydreams of being a hero, and when the time comes, he is so ready for it, bouncing off of stuff and hurling fireballs like there's no tomorrow. He's an unlikely hero only because of his origins. In character terms, he's a hero from the very beginning, determined to rescue Princess Peach no matter what it takes. Luigi is given the role of the unromantic wet blanket, an everyman whose response to every threat is either to hide or try to sneak around it. Luigi is the one to ask what kind of reward they'll get for rescuing the princess, and when he's told he can keep any treasure he finds, his eyes just light up. It's Luigi who eats a bunch of weird mushrooms when he's hungry and totally freaks out, and ends up destroying Bowser's castle by tunneling under it looking for buried treasure. He's the wild card that the scriptwriters use to make unexpected things happen, and that's what makes him cool. You know, kind of cool. And ever since then, whenever a Mario brother has to do something weird or out of character, it's a better than even chance that Luigi will be the one to do it. Because he's not Nintendo's mascot, he's free to be whatever Mario isn't. Greedy, envious, backstabbing, lazy, just generally unheroic. He's not an anti-hero like Wario, but rather the kind of hero that most of us would be if forced into the role. Sure, he does save the day, but he also complains about it and takes shortcuts, little things that any adult with responsibilities should be quite familiar with. And in my opinion, Luigi's Mansion is the peak of his character, not only because his animations have so much personality here, but also because the setting reflects his mental state in an unusual but highly effective way. Broadly speaking, the setting of Luigi's Mansion is the mansion, a big rambling domicile whose appearance and contents are based on the nature of the ghosts inhabiting it. But each individual room, particularly if it houses one of the portrait ghosts who escaped from Egad's collection, also evokes a certain theme and atmosphere. You only get a shadowy glimpse of each room's appearance while the ghosts are inhabiting it, so each is like a little Fabergé egg that opens once an objective is completed, with the lights rising to reveal what you've been bumping into all this time. And if you consider the rooms together with the portrait ghosts, every part of the mansion tells a different story that's completely distinct from the game's actual story. The first part of the game sees Luigi in the position of a guest who's arrived at a country house late at night. He starts off in the parlor, a traditional place to receive guests, and then goes through an anteroom to a place where he can hang up his coat. Since it's late, the members of the household are already winding down for the evening. Neville is reading a book in the study, Lydia is combing her hair in the master bedroom, and baby Chauncey is already asleep. Or supposed to be, anyway. Luigi sees each member of the household, and finishes by turning in for the night. Now this isn't literally what happens, but by going through these rooms, which are normally dedicated to specific purposes, one at a time, Luigi is sort of acting out what it would be like if this was a normal house. It's a game, and the house is like a giant toy. Hideki Kano and his team specifically mentioned being inspired by the concept of a dollhouse in the early stages of design. Because there are more rooms and more ghosts in the later areas, this impression of a frame story gets weaker as the game goes on, but there's always a hint of it. Area 2 contains ghosts who feel like an extension of the nuclear family seen in Area 1. Shivers is the butler, Spooky the family dog, Melody Pianissima, possibly an older sister or a cousin, and the floating Werlindas and Mr. Luggs are probably invited guests. The theme of the second day in Luigi's Mansion is entertainment of various kinds, dancing in the ballroom, a musical recital in the conservatory, and of course the endless banquet in the dining room. I particularly like that the kitchen is the last indoor place you visit before the lead up to the boss encounter in the graveyard. There's something about going from the dining room to the kitchen and then outside that reminds me of how parties always seemed to work when I was younger. By Area 3, the party is definitely over, and Luigi is now exploring the parts of the house where strangers would not be welcome. In keeping with this feeling, Luigi's encounters with portrait ghosts now feel more intrusive. He attacks Biff Atlas while he's training, catches Miss Petunia off guard in the shower, and interrupts Nana at her knitting, as well as cheating at both pool and hide-and-go-seek. Finally, in Area 4, we find the strangest and least home-like places. A cold storage room, 2 workshops full of pottery and oil paintings, an attic full of odd clocks. With the exception of Sue P., who's weird in her own way, the ghosts here also no longer feel like part of the family. They're just a bunch of oddballs, and the comfortable domestic feel of the early game is now completely absent. This progression, from charm and amusement in the early game to fear and a desire to get things over with in the late game, is interesting to me, because it feels like the emotional reaction that our hero would have to this whole experience. While Luigi is excitable and clearly afraid of ghosts, he's not without his adventurous side. For the first few hours, you can see him having fun with this crazy house and the ghosts who live in it. Notice how he shows off and grins whenever he picks up a treasure, even though just a moment ago he might have been shaking like a leaf. The designers of this game were just as careful to show how happy he is when the trouble is over as they are to display his anxiety when he's in the middle of it. Luigi doesn't have a single line of dialogue in Luigi's Mansion, but he doesn't have to talk because the experience speaks for him. Every new room is a mystery, possibly a dangerous one, but always with the potential for reward, in both an emotional and financial sense. It's the only real Mario horror game, but it also never tries to scare you for too long, both because fear wears off with too much repetition, and because being frightened all the time isn't fun. Hitchcock understood that, and if there was any game I would refer to as the virtual equivalent of a Hitchcock movie, this is it. I know that sounds like hyperbole, but it's true. Luigi's Mansion is the kind of game that could only have been made smack dab in the middle of Mario's experimental era. Before the late 90s, no one would have cared enough about setting continuity, or Luigi's personality, to create a playscape that's this intricate and interactive. And by the late 2000s, Nintendo was mostly done experimenting with new genres in the Mario series. Even its own sequels have generally failed to capture the microcosmic splendor of that original mansion and its clever, creative little rooms. And we shouldn't be too surprised at this. The first official follow-up to Luigi's Mansion came out 12 years after the original game, at a very different time in Nintendo's history, and made by a second-party affiliate rather than Nintendo itself. While there have been good direct sequels in the Mario franchise, there haven't been many in sub-series that were kept on ice for a decade. Yoshi's Island is another example of a sub-series with belated sequels that simply failed to reproduce the magic that the original had. And Yoshi's Island DS came out in 2006, while Nintendo was still trying to do new things with Mario. The sequel to Luigi's Mansion came out in 2013, just 2 years before Nintendo EAD would go the way of all divisions and be absorbed into a new, larger team. If Luigi's Mansion is the quintessential experimental era Mario game, then Dark Moon has to be considered part of a different era, one which I would argue began in 2006 with the release of New Super Mario Bros. On the DS, and was in full swing by the time Super Mario Galaxy 2 came out in 2010. By this time, Nintendo was almost completely done trying to alter Mario's brand identity by tinkering with the formula, like it had during the experimental era. This was a new age of picking and choosing among ideas that already existed in past Mario games, and coming up with innovations ad hoc, with no intention of making them a permanent part of the series' legacy. Hence my name for it, the Eclectic Era. As far as I'm concerned, we're actually still in this period, but if we stick with the 10-year pattern of the previous two eras, this would last from 2007 to 2017, ending with the release of Super Mario Odyssey, which brought back a few elements of the experimental era which hadn't been seen since the original Galaxy. Not all of the games from this era are unimaginative, strictly speaking. Arguably, none of them are. But they're all marked by a stiffer and less experimental approach to Mario's branding and appeal. And I think it has to be said, this is also the period in which Mario spin-offs either died off or stopped making contributions to the Mario legacy, further diminishing the sense of novelty that Mario used to be known for. Mario Kart and Super Smash Bros. Continued to be blockbuster franchises while relying on characters and story elements established by previous games. Mario RPGs either dried up completely, like Mario and Luigi, or stopped trying to tell complex stories, like Paper Mario from 2011 onwards. New recurring characters wouldn't be of the caliber of Rosalina or Toadette, with actual personalities and dialogue. They were more like, well, Nabbit, a glorified mook who only makes a difference in terms of gameplay. And when you talk about experiences that blow your socks off in gameplay terms, while having nothing to say in story terms, no game in the series highlights that contrast more starkly, embodying the best and the worst aspects of the eclectic era of Mario, than Super Mario Galaxy 2.